The CEO's son humiliated his father's executive assistant in front of everyone. "Do you have any idea what this shirt costs? More than you make in a month." He expected her to go quiet, but she looked him straight in the eyes and answered, "I didn't come here to serve anyone's ego." The entire office fell silent. Minutes later, he walked straight into his father's office. "Fire her." His father just smiled. "You want your stake in this company? Then you have 30 days to win her over." He agreed, convinced it would be easy. After all, she was just an assistant. What he didn't know is that she had her own plans. Avery Collins was 28 years old, had a sick mother, rent to cover on her own, and a composure that almost everyone mistook for coldness. She wasn't cold. She wasn't distant. She was strong. And there's a massive difference between those two things, even when from the outside they look exactly the same. Avery had learned to be strong at 16. The afternoon her mother came home from a doctor's appointment, holding a piece of paper and wearing an expression Avery had never seen on anyone's face before that moment. From that afternoon forward, she understood that life wasn't going to wait for her, that she could fall apart on the inside all she wanted, but outside, she had to keep moving. That rent came due every month, no matter how she felt. That the grocery store didn't close on hard days. She put herself through college on scholarships and part-time jobs. She graduated at 22 at the top of her class, with a degree in business administration and the very clear understanding that no one was going to hand her anything. And at 25, she landed the job that changed everything. Executive assistant to Mr. Edward Harrington, CEO of the Harrington Group, one of the most significant privately held conglomerates in the Midwest, with divisions spanning commercial real estate, industrial manufacturing, and a logistics network that Avery had come to understand as well as Edward himself over these 4 years. 4 years. In that time, Avery had learned which reports came in late every 2 weeks without fail, which vendor always called on Friday afternoons with excuses, which meetings to schedule first thing Monday when Edward arrived fresh and patient, and which ones to hold until Wednesday afternoon when the second cup of coffee had done its work and his tolerance for bad news was higher. She knew the business better than most of the directors who sat in those glass-walled conference rooms with MBA framed on their office walls. But what she valued most about that job wasn't the salary, which was good. It wasn't the title, which carried weight. It wasn't the corner building view from the 32nd floor. It was the man she worked for. Edward Harrington was one of those people who barely exist in certain worlds anymore. He had the power to change the lives of hundreds of families with a single decision, and yet he remembered the name of every person in the building. He asked about families, not as small talk, not as corporate performance, but because he genuinely cared. He noticed when someone walked in carrying something heavy, even when they never said a word about it. He acted before anyone had to ask. Avery knew this better than anyone, because 2 years earlier, when her mother Diane received a diagnosis that made Avery's world stop completely, when the doctor's words seemed to come from very far away and the simplest things stopped making sense, it was Edward who showed up, without her asking, without anyone telling him to. He just walked into Lakeview Medical Center on a Tuesday evening, still in the suit he'd worn to the office, sat down in the plastic waiting room chair beside her like it was the most natural thing in the world, and said, "You're not alone in this, Avery, and you won't be." And he meant it, not as a polite thing to say, as a real commitment. He arranged personally for Diane to enter the best treatment program available. He connected the right specialists. He made sure nothing was interrupted for lack of resources, and he never once asked Avery to pay him back. He never mentioned it as a favor. He never used it. "What I do for you, I do because you deserve it," he had told her once when she tried to bring it up. "And because my conscience asks it of me, that's the whole explanation. That doesn't leave you. You hold it. In that place where you put the few things that actually matter, alongside the names of the people who showed up when you needed someone most. There are people you don't forget because they were kind. There are people you don't forget because they were there when it counted." Edward was the second kind, and Avery, who had learned very young to tell the difference between people who promised and people who followed through, knew exactly which category he was in. That's why Avery arrived 15 minutes before everyone else every single day. That's why every detail of the calendar was always handled before anyone had to ask. That's why when Edward needed something, it was already done before he finished asking. And that's why when the moment came that Edward needed something different from her, something no calendar entry or briefing document could solve, Avery was there for that too. That Tuesday in January, Avery walked into the executive floor carrying 2 cups of coffee, one for Edward, as always, at the exact temperature he preferred, with the exact amount of cream. No sugar, no variations, none of the little personalized touches that well-meaning new hires sometimes added on their own. The second cup was a spontaneous gesture. Jackson Harrington had arrived from New York that morning. Avery had crossed paths with him a handful of times in 4 years. Enough to have formed an opinion, not quite enough to be fully certain it was fair. Jackson was 33. He was tall, with dark brown hair, sharp grey eyes, and that particular kind of jaw that seemed designed to project certainty in every room he entered. He had a way of standing that occupied space without asking permission, and a gaze that evaluated quickly, sorting everything it landed on by immediate relevance. He was smart. That much couldn't be argued. But he was the kind of smart that gets confused with superiority, the kind that evaluates everything in seconds and rarely wonders if it got the answer wrong. Jackson wasn't usually willing to wonder. He'd spent 3 years running the company's New York division, and he came back to Chicago the way some people return to a hotel they've stayed in before, comfortable, familiar, without any real emotional attachment to the place. That morning he was standing at the window in his father's office, phone pressed to his right ear, talking to someone with the tone of a man who always has something urgent going on and needs the world to know it. His left hand moved on its own as he spoke, gesturing toward nothing in particular with the energy of someone who thinks with his whole body. Avery paused in the doorway for just a second. He was good-looking, yes, she wouldn't deny that. But there was something in the way he spoke on the phone inside someone else's office, the way he gestured toward the window, like the space already belonged to him, the way he hadn't acknowledged a single person when he arrived that morning. That told her everything she needed to know about who someone was when they thought no one was watching. Avery walked in, placed Edward's coffee on his desk with the precision of 4 years of practice, and made her way to the side conference table to set down the second cup near where Jackson was standing. A courtesy, nothing more. The kind of small thing she did naturally for anyone in her boss's office. 1 second, just 1 second of bad timing. Jackson pivoted on his heel without looking, his left arm sweeping wide as he emphasized something he was saying into the phone, and his elbow caught the edge of the tray with a force neither of them expected. The coffee launched in a clean arc, straight into his white dress shirt, collar to chest. The silence that followed had its own weight. Jackson lowered the phone very slowly. He looked at the stain. He looked at Avery. And for 1 second, just one, it was clear he was deciding whether to acknowledge this was an accident. That second passed. What came next wasn't the benefit of the doubt. What was that? It was an accident, said Avery, with the same calm she would have used to say good morning or the briefing is on your desk, a calm that clearly bothered him more than the hot coffee. An accident, he repeated, and those 2 words carried a volume of condescension that Avery clocked in a fraction of a second. Right, of course. Edward, behind his desk, looked up from his papers. Jackson looked at his shirt again. Do you have any idea what this shirt costs? Avery didn't answer. More than you make in a month. He said it the way someone states the temperature outside. Objective, matter of fact. I'd suggest that in the future, when you're moving through a workspace where people are trying to conduct business, you pay a little more attention to what you're doing. Not everyone has the same patience for this kind of carelessness. 2 administrative coordinators passing in the glass hallway slowed their pace without meaning to. Someone in the adjacent office heard too. Everyone saw, and Avery felt heat rise through her throat, climb to her face and settle there. That specific heat that comes when humiliation and anger arrive at the same time, and you don't quite know which one to address first. But she didn't lower her gaze. She looked at him directly, and she spoke. Mr. Harrington, my role in this building is to serve as your father's executive assistant, not yours. Bringing that second cup of coffee was a spontaneous courtesy to someone visiting the office. It wasn't on any task list. It wasn't my obligation. I did it because it's what people do when they want to be considerate. Pause. My job is to work for Edward, and I do it gladly, because he actually knows how to treat the people who work with him. Jackson opened his mouth. And if in your opinion that constitutes carelessness, Avery added, then the next time you visit, don't expect me to bring anything, because I didn't come here to serve anyone's ego. She picked up the tray. She picked up the empty cup. And she walked out of the office at the same pace as always. No rushing, no slamming the door. The same steady calm she'd carried in, as if nothing had happened. Out in the hallway, she made it to the break room, set the tray on the counter, and went still for a moment. Her hands were trembling slightly, just a little, just the amount of time it takes for something to settle before a person can go back to functioning normally. She breathed and went back to work, because she wasn't cold. She was strong. And the difference between those two things is sometimes just the time you have before someone sees the moment you break. What happened inside the office after Avery closed the door was something she didn't know about until much later. Jackson stood still for a moment, looking at the closed door. Then he looked at his father. Edward was watching him from behind the desk, with an expression Jackson couldn't fully read. It wasn't exactly anger. It was something closer to deep disappointment, the kind that comes with a long history behind it. "She's way out of line," Jackson said, setting his phone on the desk harder than necessary. Edward didn't respond. He waited. "Dad, seriously, an assistant doesn't talk to the owner's son like that. That's not how you run a company." "She spilled coffee on you by accident," said Edward slowly, with the calm of someone who has chosen every word before speaking it. "And you humiliated her in front of people who had nothing to do with what happened." "I was just telling her—" "Jackson." Just that. Just his name. But in his father's voice, those 3 syllables closed his son's sentence before it reached anywhere. Silence. "What you did in there was a serious lack of class." Edward leaned back in his chair. "And you know it." Jackson pressed his jaw tight. "So what's the move? If it bothers you that much, let her go and bring in someone else. Someone who can carry a tray without causing a scene." Edward looked at him for a long moment. A very long one. The kind that isn't discomfort but decision in process. "Let Avery go," his father repeated very slowly, as if weighing each word. "It's the logical call. Jackson, in 4 years Avery Collins has demonstrated more integrity, more judgment and more genuine loyalty than most of the executives who walk through this building with their business school credentials and their expense accounts." Edward stood up. "Do you know what I see when I look at you right now?" Jackson didn't answer. "I see a 33-year-old man who doesn't know how to treat the people around him, who confuses respect with compliance, who believes money excuses everything, and who hasn't realized after all these years that I didn't build all of this to hand it to someone who treats people like they're tools. That's not—" "Stay in Chicago," said Edward. "You have 30 days. Jackson frowned. 30 days to do what? To earn Avery Collins's respect. The silence that followed was a different category entirely. Jackson looked at his father, waiting for him to smile, waiting for something else to follow that would change what he'd just heard. Edward didn't smile. "Are you actually serious?" "Completely." "Dad, that's insane. She's an assistant. I date—" "People who seek you out for what you have," said Edward, without raising his voice. "Avery Collins doesn't want anything you have, and that, son, is exactly why you're the one who needs to learn something here, not her." Jackson walked to the window. He looked down at the street below, the taxis, the people moving past on the sidewalk without knowing that up here, someone was calculating whether swallowing his pride was worth what was being put on the table. "And if after 30 days I get nowhere, then you're not ready to lead this group when I step down." Pause. "And I'm stepping down sooner than you think." Jackson took a moment. "Does anyone else know about this?" "Just the 2 of us." Another pause. Jackson turned. "Fine." And in that fine, there were several things at once. Wounded pride that refused to look bad. Something that felt like anger. The certainty that 30 days was more than enough time for what his father was asking. And a thought he didn't say out loud, but that sat there, clear as anything, as familiar as his own voice. That woman. Impossible. We'll see about that. Jackson had dated models, executives, women who appeared in the social pages of city magazines, women who understood exactly how his world worked, who spoke his language, who knew the rules. An assistant, no matter how self-assured, was no different from anyone else. At least that's what Jackson told himself while he arranged to stay in his father's guest suite and started planning his approach like it was a business expansion strategy. What he still didn't know was that this certainty was about to be the first of many things he'd have to reconsider. What Jackson didn't know was that same afternoon, while he was getting settled and mapping out his strategy, his father requested a meeting, not over the phone, in person. Avery walked into the office with her notebook and pen, as always. Edward pointed to the chair, without the notebook, and waited for her to sit. That alone was different. "Avery, before I say what I need to say, I need you to hear something first." She looked at him. "You have every right to tell me no, without anything between us changing, without any consequences, without having to explain yourself, understood? She nodded, and Edward told her everything, the challenge, the 30 days, the conversation he'd had with his son that morning. Avery listened without interrupting. Jackson isn't a bad person, said Edward, with that tired honesty parents carry when they've exhausted the easy justifications. But he grew up in a world where no one ever told him no and meant it, where everything came without real effort, without consequences, without anyone showing him the world doesn't revolve around him. He paused. And that was my fault. I was so busy building something to leave him that I forgot to teach him the most basic things, how to see the people around him, how to treat them, how to be someone who actually deserves what he has. Avery was still listening. I'm not asking you to fake feelings you don't have, he clarified. I'm not asking you to fall for him or pretend this morning didn't happen. I'm only asking you to give him a chance to be around you. Don't shut him out from the start. Let him try. A brief pause. And let him run into a few learning experiences. He held a longer pause. I know my son, Avery. He's going to show up with flowers, with fancy restaurants, with everything that's always worked for him before. He's going to run straight into a wall. He's going to learn something about how to treat people. He smiled with that rare blend of love and exhaustion that parents wear when talking about their children. And after a few days, he'll give up. That's all I'm expecting from this. One lesson, nothing more. What Edward didn't calculate was that this time his son was not going to give up. It was right there. That last word. Something in Avery's eyes shifted. Not sadness, not obligation. Something much closer to pure, quiet strategy. Learning experiences? She repeated slowly. Edward looked at her, and Avery smiled. Small, a little crooked. The smile of someone who is already calculating something with considerable pleasure. Edward, what if I help him learn? But my way? Your way? You say he needs lessons, she said, completely calm. I can deliver them, but I'm not going to be his etiquette coach or his manners consultant. I'm going to be exactly myself, with everything that entails. Edward looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed. A real one. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and has nothing calculated about it. The kind that makes the air in a room feel lighter in an instant. Avery Collins, he said, still grinning. You are exactly what that man needs right now. She agreed. Not for money. There was no money involved, not out of obligation. But because Edward had been there when her world was coming apart, when no one else knew how to be present, and because something in her, the part that never fully switched off, wanted to see how far a man that certain of himself would go, when the world stopped turning exactly the way he expected it to. The first few days were exactly what Avery expected, and the complete opposite of what Jackson had planned. He arrived Wednesday with a confidence that smelled like strategy and expensive cologne. He stopped in front of Avery's desk and waited for her to look up. Avery kept typing. Good morning, he said at last. Good morning, she answered without looking away from the screen. Silence. Jackson waited for the space the other person usually fills. The glance, the small smile, the opening. Avery didn't fill any space. I wanted to apologize, he said finally. For yesterday I was... That's not necessary. Avery, seriously. Mr. Harrington. She looked up for the first time. Same composure as always. No trace of resentment, no trace of invitation. If you have anything related to your father's schedule, I'm happy to help. If not, I have a lot of work to get through. And she went back to the screen. Jackson stood there a beat longer than he should have, then left. He wasn't used to that kind of exit, to being the one who didn't choose when the conversation ended. The following Monday he arrived with a floral arrangement that was, objectively, too large to be carried by one person. White and red roses, full and extravagant, the kind of arrangement you see in movies when someone wants to make a visual statement. The delivery service had brought it up before him and left it at the reception desk because it wouldn't fit in the elevator without help. For you, Jackson said, walking in behind it with the smile of someone who knows this works. It had always worked. Without exception, Avery looked at it, looked at the flowers, looked at him. Do you have a pollen allergy, Mr. Harrington? Me? No. Why? I do, she said with complete naturalness, and with an almost ceremonial care, as if it were the most logical thing anyone could do with an enormous floral arrangement. She lifted it, walked it to the waiting area down the hall, and placed it in the center of the coffee table with a handwritten note that said, "For the team, with appreciation." Jackson saw it from the hallway. His imported roses, sitting on the waiting room table between an old trade magazine and an empty paper cup, with a note that said, "For the team," with appreciation. He took a moment to process that, and he couldn't quite decide what bothered him more, losing the flowers or admitting he hadn't seen that coming. Wednesday brought a box of imported European chocolates, the kind that come in a lacquered wooden case with a magnetic clasp and a silk ribbon inside. The kind with the country of origin embossed on the packaging that almost no one in the building had ever tasted. Avery opened them, looked at them with an appreciation that was completely genuine because the chocolates deserved it, and carried them to the conference room table along with the 10 o'clock coffee. For the team also. Jackson walked into that morning's review meeting to find 3 members of the finance team eating his chocolates with their coffee. He sat down. He said nothing. But the expression on his face was fairly specific. Thursday, he tried a different approach. He came to Avery directly with a work-related excuse that was transparent, but at least had some surface logic to it. Said he needed to pull up some archived contracts and wasn't sure how the filing system was organized. It was the kind of excuse anyone could have seen coming from 3 floors away, but it gave him a reason to be nearby without it looking completely obvious. Avery helped him, with the same efficiency as always. She walked him through the filing system in exactly 4 minutes, showed him where the documents he supposedly needed were located, asked if there was anything else. "No," said Jackson. "Have a good day then," she said, and went back to her work. Jackson stood in the hallway for a second, then went to his meeting, and thought, for the first time in his entire life, that someone was ignoring him in a way that wasn't annoying. It was, somehow, interesting. By Friday, with every one of those moves exhausted, Jackson appeared with what he clearly considered his strongest play. "There's a reservation tonight at the Summit, the most exclusive restaurant in downtown Chicago, weeks-long wait list, tasting menu with wine pairing, best food in the city, views over the lake. I'd like to take you to dinner." Avery looked at him for a moment. "If you genuinely want to apologize," she said slowly, "the apology doesn't get eaten at the Summit." Jackson frowned. "Then where?" "I choose the place." Pause. Jackson calculated something in those 2 seconds. Something in her tone told him clearly enough that whatever was coming wasn't going to be what he expected. But pride is a peculiar thing. Sometimes it's stronger than instinct. "Fine," he said, and Avery nodded, with the same smile as before, the one that wasn't exactly reassuring. Saturday evening, Jackson arrived on time to the meeting point she'd sent him by text. He'd put more thought into what to wear than he would have admitted if anyone had asked. Casual but sharp, the kind of clothes that say you didn't try, even though you clearly did. Avery showed up 2 minutes later, in comfortable, natural clothes, a simple tote bag on her shoulder, and exactly the same composure she carried every day. "Ready?" she asked. "Where are we going?" "You'll see." The place Avery brought him to did not appear in any city dining guide. It had no presence on any review platform. No social media, no designed logo, no digital menu. It was a small diner in a working-class neighborhood on the northwest side of the city, with vinyl booths in a faded blue that had seen better decades, mismatched chairs at the counter, walls painted a shade of yellow that must have felt cheerful at some point in history, and a ceiling fan with one slightly warped blade that produced a constant rhythmic sound, somewhere between a mechanical hum and a resigned complaint. The smell was pronounced. A combination of fryer oil, coffee that had been warming too long, and something indefinable that had been absorbed into the walls over decades. Jackson stopped in the doorway. He looked at the hand-painted sign above the entrance. He looked at the booths occupied by large families, a table of construction workers still in their work gear, and a group of teenagers laughing loudly in the back corner. He looked at Avery, who was already inside, seated in one of the faded blue booths, her bag on the seat beside her completely at ease, studying the laminated menu like it was the card at a Michelin-starred restaurant. Jackson walked in. He sat down across from her, with all the dignity he could gather in that moment, or whatever he had left. The server came over, a man in his 60s with an apron that had more history than most documents, and an attitude that made it very clear every customer was exactly equal in his eyes, regardless of what they were wearing. "What can I get you?" Jackson looked at the menu. It was a single laminated sheet written in marker, with a few items crossed out and rewritten above them in different handwriting. The prices made a coffee from the office vending machine look like a luxury item. No tasting menu, no wine pairing. Nothing Jackson would have ordered in any other context of his life. He thought about standing up. He thought about what his father would say. He thought about the expression on Avery's face if he backed out before the food arrived. And he ordered. The server noted it without extra enthusiasm, glanced over at Avery, and she simply shook her head. No explanation. The server left without follow-up questions. What arrived wasn't what Jackson would have chosen in any other version of his life. But it was hot, and there was plenty of it, and the man with the apron put it on the table with the efficiency of someone who has done exactly this for decades and needs no one's approval. One plate. His. Jackson looked at the food, looked at Avery. Avery had her arms crossed on the vinyl table surface, completely relaxed. No menu in her hands, no indication whatsoever that she intended to order anything. And Jackson, because pride didn't leave him any other option, picked up his fork and ate, with every ounce of stoicism he could manage, while Avery watched him from across the table, as if she were observing something mildly entertaining. A few minutes passed. Jackson ate. Avery watched. The warped ceiling fan kept turning with its steady mechanical complaint. Finally, Jackson looked up. "What about you? You're not getting anything." "No," she said. Jackson put his fork down for a moment. "Nothing at all?" "Nothing at all." He looked at her, looked at his plate. And then, because he still hadn't fully grasped the situation he was in, he asked, "What would you order here if you were ordering something?" Avery looked at him directly, with that perfect composure of hers, and said, in exactly the same tone she might use to comment on the weather or the price of parking downtown, "I wouldn't eat here, not if it were a matter of life or death." The second that followed was absolute. Jackson set his fork on his plate. Slowly. The warped ceiling fan kept turning. Someone at the back asked for a coffee refill. Jackson looked at her, looked at his plate, looked back at her, and understood, with a clarity that arrived late but complete, that he had been eating in the worst diner in Chicago for several minutes, while she watched him with all the patience in the world, waiting for exactly this moment. He processed that, thought of at least 4 responses, and somewhere between completely justified outrage and something he still didn't know how to name, he laughed, short, without warning, without calculation, real, the first genuine laugh since he'd arrived in Chicago, with all his certainty intact. He picked up his fork again and kept eating, because if there was one thing in Jackson Harrington besides pride, it was the ability to finish what he started. "You handled that very well," said Avery, with exactly the same expression, as if she were complimenting him on submitting a difficult report on time. "Genuinely. I mean it." Jackson looked at her. "You are something else," he said, and he wasn't entirely sure if he meant it as a complaint. They left the diner and walked along the sidewalk toward where Avery had parked. The evening outside was cold. January in Chicago. Not the brutal cold of February, but the sharp, biting kind that reminds you the city is serious about winter. Halfway to her car, without announcing it, Avery stopped at a taco truck parked on the corner. She ordered 2 with a familiarity that made clear this truck was trustworthy, paid before Jackson could react, and ate while walking with the natural ease of someone who does this all the time. Jackson walked beside her, without saying anything. Watching her eat with that calm she applied to everything. At a red light, he stopped beside her while they waited for the signal. "Do you always choose the restaurant like that?" he asked at last. "Like what?" With complete intention, Avery looked at him for a moment. "I chose the most honest place I know," she said. "No pretense. What you see is what you get." Jackson absorbed that. "And I'm not honest?" "You came to Chicago with a plan," she said simply. "Plans are rarely completely honest." The light changed. They walked. "What about you?" he asked. "Do you have plans?" Avery finished the last taco before she answered. "I have priorities," she said. "It's different." Jackson thought about that the whole way to where she'd parked. He didn't say anything more, didn't need to, and thought for the first time since arriving in this city with all his certainties intact that he had badly miscalculated. That this woman was not one single thing he had decided she was that Tuesday morning, with a coffee stain on his shirt and his pride on fire. And that unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. Not even a little. What followed wasn't a transformation that happened overnight. It wasn't a moment of sudden clarity, where everything falls into place and the music swells. It was slower than that, more uncomfortable, more real. The chocolates stopped appearing. The flowers didn't return either. Jackson stopped showing up with elaborate excuses and started showing up without them. One day he came into the filing room while Avery was organizing contract folders that hadn't been touched in months, and without asking whether he could, and without waiting for anyone to say it was a good idea, picked up a folder and started helping organize. He didn't mention it afterward. He didn't wait for anyone to acknowledge it. He just did it. Avery noticed from the corner of her eye, and said nothing. But she registered it. In the break room one Tuesday afternoon, when the executive floor was quieter than usual and the light outside had taken on the flat gray tone of Chicago January afternoons, Jackson found her standing with her coffee mug and her gaze somewhere that wasn't in the room. It wasn't the posture of someone resting. It was the posture of someone who has been carrying something and is using a quiet moment to set it down briefly. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," she answered, automatic. Jackson didn't move, didn't accept that as an answer. "Doesn't look like it." Avery looked at him, and he held that look without filling the silence, without rushing, without offering solutions no one had asked for. It was the first time anyone in that office had asked that question and then actually waited for the real answer. "My mom had a rough night," she said finally. "She's doing better, but sometimes the good days and the hard days come so close together that you lose track of which one you're in." Jackson nodded. "What does she have?" Avery hesitated, not because she didn't trust him exactly in that moment, but because talking about her mother out loud still carried the specific weight of things she'd learned to carry quietly. And then she told him, the diagnosis 2 years ago, the long treatment, the adjustments, the small setbacks, the days where Diane showed visible improvement, and the days where her body seemed exhausted from fighting something so persistent. Jackson listened. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't pull out his phone to look up specialists or connections who could help. He didn't compare it to a story about someone he knew. He just listened, eyes on her, full attention on what she was saying. And that was, strangely, the most unexpected thing Avery had experienced in all those months. That same week, on a Thursday afternoon, during a coordination meeting where the finance division was presenting quarter-close numbers, Avery's phone vibrated on the table. She ignored it. It vibrated again. She ignored it again. The third time, when she flipped it over and saw the name on the screen, something in her shifted temperature. It was Lakeview Medical Center. When they called 3 times in a row, it meant it couldn't wait. She stood up quietly, walked out of the conference room, and answered in the hallway with the phone pressed hard against her ear and her free hand closed in a fist at her side. "What happened? Is she stable?" "Yes, okay, I'm on my way." Jackson had watched her leave from inside the conference room, had noticed something in the way she did it. And without anyone asking, without thinking it through, he picked up his jacket from his chair and followed her out. He found her in the hallway with the phone already back in her pocket and the expression of someone who has just received news they need to process in motion. "What happened?" "My mom," she said, and in those 2 words her voice was completely different from anything he'd heard from her before. Smaller, more real. "She's in the ER. Let's go." "You don't have to. Let's go." Not an order. Not the tone of someone with money who believes that solves things. Not condescension of any kind. The quiet certainty of someone who has decided something and the discussion is already over. And Avery, who at that moment had no energy available for arguing, didn't argue. In the car, Jackson drove without music, without talking more than necessary, without checking his phone at red lights. He just took the fastest route, while Avery looked out the window at something that wasn't in any street in Chicago. When they arrived at Lakeview Medical Center, she went straight to the emergency reception, and he stayed in the waiting room. He sat. He took out his phone, put it away. He stood up, found something from the coffee machine that was technically coffee only because it was hot and liquid, and sat back down. He waited. Almost an hour. It was during that hour that Edward arrived. Jackson watched his father come through the automatic doors with the step of someone who knows the way. No searching for signs. No asking at the desk which hallway led where. A familiarity that wasn't the familiarity of a first visit. Jackson stood up. His father saw him and paused. "Jackson, I didn't expect to find you here." "You know Avery's mother?" Jackson asked. Edward looked at him, and in that look there was something that took a moment to process. "Diane has been in treatment here for over 2 years, his father said. "I stepped in when Avery had no way to manage what was needed." The silence that followed was different from any before it. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Edward sat in the chair beside him and took a moment before answering. "Because not everything is mine to share, son." Pause. "And because at the time, you wouldn't have understood why." Jackson looked toward the door Avery had walked through, and something shifted inside him. Not exactly guilt, though there was some of that too. Something deeper, more uncomfortable. Recognition. His father, the man he had always seen as a figure of authority, the one he'd wanted to impress, the one he'd disagreed with, the one he'd distanced himself from more than he'd realized, was this man, the one who showed up at a hospital when no one asked him to, the one who covered treatment costs without making noise about it, the one who genuinely cared about the people around him. Jackson had spent years trying to prove to his father that he could run divisions, close deals, make hard calls in boardrooms where everyone wore expensive suits and no one showed what they actually felt. And he had never once seen the most important thing his father did, the hardest thing to copy, the thing no boardroom teaches. Jackson sat in that plastic waiting room chair and thought about something he hadn't thought about in a long time. He thought about the last time he'd been somewhere without something to gain, without an agenda, without an objective, without an expected result. And he couldn't find a clear answer. That bothered him more than he expected. When Avery came out from the emergency area more than an hour later, with her hair slightly loose from where it had been pulled back and the most tired expression Jackson had seen on her face, she found the two of them sitting together in silence in the waiting room. She stopped. "Edward, I already spoke to the attending physician," said the older man, standing. "She's stable. They're going to adjust the medication this week. Everything is going to be okay, Avery." She nodded, and something in her eyes caught the light for just a second. Only a second, before she brought it back under control. Jackson saw it, and in that moment, in that waiting room with plastic chairs and cold fluorescent light and the distant sound of a rolling cart somewhere down the hall, he understood something that the 30 days, the flowers, the chocolates, the strategies, and the worst diner in Chicago hadn't been able to teach him. This woman carried a lot, and she carried it alone, every day, and still arrived 15 minutes early, and had everything handled before anyone asked, and answered calmly when someone humiliated her in public, and smiled in that way that was hard to read from the outside, without anyone knowing what she carried, without asking for anyone to know. Jackson thought about the coffee spilled on his shirt that Tuesday, about what he'd said after, about how certain he'd been that he was completely right, and felt something that wasn't exactly shame, but was close to something more useful than shame. Clarity, the uncomfortable kind that arrives when you finally see something that was in front of you all along. Something changed in Jackson after that night. Not all at once. Without announcement. Quieter than that. He stopped keeping count of the days. One Tuesday, he brought breakfast for the entire executive floor. Pastries from a small bakery near his father's building, one of those neighborhood spots that had been doing the same thing for 30 years and whose regulars would tell you it was the best in the city. He left them in the break room without announcing he'd brought them, without a note with his name, without waiting for anyone to say anything about it. Avery arrived at 7:45 as always and found the pastries and knew exactly who had left them, even with no signature. She didn't say anything, but something in her registered it differently than every flower and every chocolate, because there's a difference between giving something when you expect gratitude and leaving something just because. Another evening he stayed late, helping put together a presentation Avery had to deliver the next morning. That would have been exhausting to finish alone. Jackson had no valid reason to stay. It wasn't his project. It wasn't his area. It wasn't his responsibility in any sense. But he stayed, and they worked together with the mediocre break-room coffee that was all that was left at that hour, with the city lighting up outside the windows, talking about what was needed and occasionally about something more, in a way that was different from everything before. At one point, Avery caught a data error in one of the slides, something that would have slipped by unnoticed and caused problems in the next morning's presentation. She corrected it, explained it briefly, kept going. Jackson watched her do it. "Do you always catch things like that?" "Almost always," she said, without looking away from the screen. "And when you don't?" Avery thought for a second. "When I'm very tired," she said, "or when something is worrying me more than it should." Jackson nodded. He didn't add anything, but he thought about that answer on the drive back to his father's house. He thought about how it was the first time someone had talked to him about their own limits like that, without drama, without asking him to understand, just naming them as objective features of reality. He thought about how he'd never learned to do that himself, how naming his own limits had always felt like losing something. One afternoon in the filing room, while they looked for a contract from 3 years back that no one could quite remember where it had been filed, Avery pulled out a folder, checked it without finding what she needed, and said without looking at him, "Why did you agree to the deal with your father?" Jackson took a moment, kept looking through the folders. "Pride," he said at last, with an honesty that surprised him. "At first, I thought it would be simple, that within 2 weeks you'd be—" He paused. "I don't know, impressed." "And?" Jackson found the folder they were looking for. He pulled it out, and before handing it to her, he looked at her. And I realized I had no idea how to impress someone in a way that actually counts. Avery took the folder, left the room, but something in her stayed behind in those filing shelves. Something that took more to shake than she expected. And that night, when she got home and read her mother's text saying she was feeling better and sending love, Avery sat on her couch for a moment with the phone in her hand, thinking about that sentence. I had no idea how to impress someone in a way that actually counts. She thought it might have been the first completely honest thing Jackson Harrington had said since arriving in Chicago, and she thought about how that, in some way she still couldn't quite name, mattered. It was the Wednesday of the third week when Jackson went to his father's office with something on his face that wasn't the usual confidence. It was something more nervous, more real. He said he wanted to invite Avery to dinner at the house that evening, the three of them. He wanted to do something more intentional. He had something he wanted to say to her. Edward didn't ask what. He just called Avery that morning. That evening, she arrived at the Harrington home with her usual composure, though for the first time in a while she wasn't entirely sure how she'd feel when the evening ended. Edward received them both with that genuine warmth of his. Dinner was easy. There were long conversations and moments of laughter, and something all three of them recognized, though no one named it, as real normalcy. Jackson was quieter than usual, but in a different way than normal. Not the controlled calm of someone managing a situation, the kind that comes from actually paying attention. After dinner, Edward excused himself to take a call, and Avery stepped out to the back terrace. She didn't hear Jackson still nearby, just on the other side of the slightly open door. She didn't know Edward wasn't actually on any call. And sometimes, when we believe we're completely alone, words come out differently, not as a speech, as thinking out loud. "I can't keep doing this," said Avery, looking at the dark garden from the terrace. She was talking to no one and to herself at the same time. "This is getting too hard." Pause. "This is not what I planned for." Jackson heard those three sentences from inside, and in his mind, they assembled in one specific way, the way that hurts most when someone's pride is already bruised and their guard is already up. He walked into the dining room. Edward saw him coming from across the room, and something in his expression shifted. "Jackson, how long have you known?" She knew, Jackson said. His father's silence answered. Jackson nodded slowly, jaw tight, something in his eyes that was earlier than anger, softer than anger, harder to show. When Avery came in from the terrace, she found him standing in the middle of the dining room. She knew before he said a word. "Everything okay?" You knew. Not a question, a statement. Avery didn't answer, and that silence told him more than any words would have. "From the beginning," he said, "the plan, the 30 days, everything that happened this whole time, was it an experiment? Was every conversation just part of a script?" "Jackson, let me explain." "Explain what?" His voice didn't get louder, but something in it broke, slightly. "That I was just a project to you? A problem someone decided was worth fixing? That's not what this was." "Then what was it? Because what I heard just now on that terrace," he stopped, "sounded exactly like someone who's done with something they started out of obligation. You didn't hear the end." "I heard enough." And in his eyes, behind all that pride that had always taken up too much space, Avery saw something she hadn't expected to see. Vulnerability without armor. Real hurt. The kind that belongs to someone who had started to believe in something. "Jackson, thanks for dinner," he said, and left. Edward from across the room stayed quiet with the weight of what he'd set in motion, without calculating all of its costs. Avery didn't sleep well that night, not because she regretted the arrangement, but because what kept her awake wasn't the past. It was the present. It was having seen in Jackson's eyes exactly what she hadn't wanted to see. Real vulnerability. No calculation. No strategy. The man who 3 weeks ago had told her his shirt cost more than she made in a month was the same man who that night had said, "Was I just that to you?" in a voice that had absolutely nothing arrogant in it. That's not performed. She knew it, because she wasn't performing either when she started looking forward to seeing him come down the hallway, when she laughed for real at his stumbles, when she stopped seeing him as Edward's project and started seeing him simply as Jackson, as someone who was learning, with difficulty, with mistakes, with more genuine effort than she'd expected to see. Avery sat on the edge of her bed at 2 in the morning with a glass of water in her hand and thought about the first time she'd actually seen him, not in the office, not during the flowers or the chocolates or the terrible diner, but in the hospital waiting room, with the bad vending machine coffee in his hands, waiting without anyone asking him to, not knowing whether she'd even acknowledge it. That was the moment. That was when something in her had moved, quietly and without announcement. She had thought about telling him that evening at dinner, and she hadn't been able to, because the part of her that had learned to be strong had also learned to be careful about what she let in. The next day, Jackson didn't come to the office. Avery worked in silence through the whole day. She answered emails, scheduled 3 meetings, prepared the weekly brief for Edward. She did everything she needed to do with the same precision as always, and the break room was empty, and she noticed it more than she wanted to. That afternoon she went to the hospital, not because her mother was doing badly. Diane was stable, improving. Avery went because sometimes you need to go to the place where you know someone will love you without conditions or context. Diane saw her walk in, and she knew. Mothers always know. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing, Mom." Diane waited. Avery sat in the chair beside her, took her mother's hand, and looked out the window for a moment. "Do you remember when you told me I carried everything alone because I didn't know how not to?" "I remember." "I think you were right." Diane squeezed her hand. "Who is he?" Avery looked at her. "How do you know it's a he?" Diane smiled. "Because that specific look on your face, I recognize it. I had it once too, a long time ago, when your father showed up in my life in a way I hadn't asked for and didn't expect." Avery didn't answer, but she didn't deny it either. "Do you have feelings for him?" Diane asked. A pause. "I don't know how to name what I feel yet." "That's already enough of an answer," said Diane. "When you know exactly what you feel right away, it's because it doesn't matter too much. When you can't find the word for it," she paused, "it's because it matters a lot." Avery looked at her mother and thought that sometimes the wisest people in the world are in hospital beds complaining the breakfast is cold. "I made mistakes too," Avery said at last. "Everyone does. Mine were deliberate." "The important ones always are," said Diane. "Does he know?" "Yes." And even knowing that, Avery didn't finish her mother's sentence. She just nodded. Diane squeezed her hand one more time. "Then you already know what you need to do." At the Harrington house, Jackson spent that day and the next without leaving. Edward tried to talk the first night. He knocked. Jackson didn't answer. Edward stood in the hallway for a moment, then left. The second day, his father came in anyway, not as an intrusion, more like the certainty of someone who knows there are moments when waiting isn't respect, it's abandonment. He sat in the chair by the window and waited. Jackson was on the edge of the bed, looking at the floor, with the kind of silence that doesn't ask for company, but doesn't ask you to leave either. Several quiet minutes passed. Outside, the backyard was still. A bird sang somewhere in one of the trees, and then was gone. It was Jackson who spoke first. "Why did you do this to me?" Edward looked at him. "Because I got it wrong with you," he said, "and that's the most honest answer I have." Jackson frowned. "What did you get wrong?" "Believing that giving you everything was the same as raising you well." Edward spoke slowly, weighing each word. "I gave you the company. I gave you the resources. I gave you the opportunities. And I forgot to teach you the most basic things. How to see the people around you. How to treat them. How to be someone who actually deserves what they have." Long silence. Jackson looked at the window. "Avery wasn't a trap," his father continued. "She was an opportunity. And she agreed not because I called in a favor, but because there's real affection on her part toward me. And because," Edward paused, "because she saw something in you, Jackson. Something worth the effort. Before I ever proposed any of this." Jackson took a while to respond. "What I heard on the terrace—" "You didn't hear the end." Jackson looked at him. Edward held the look. "What you didn't hear was, this is not what I planned for, but I fell for him." The silence that followed was completely different from everyone before it in that conversation. Jackson closed his eyes for 1 second, processed. "How do I know that's true?" "You don't," his father said simply. "You have to go ask her." Long pause. "And this time, Jackson, no strategy, no plan. No 30 days or any other number, just you. And what you actually feel." Edward stood. At the door before leaving, he stopped. "Do you know what weighs on me most about all of this?" His son looked at him. "That I spent too many years building something to leave you, and I didn't realize the most important thing was just being present. Here, with you, in the moments that count." His voice, always so controlled, had something different in it then, more fragile. "Forgive me for the plan. I didn't want to hurt you." Jackson looked at his father for a moment. He thought of several things to say. In the end, he only said, "I haven't made it easy for you either." Edward looked at him. And in that short sentence, in that small admission, there was something both of them felt the same way, the beginning of something that had been a long time starting. He saw his father, not as authority, not as the head of the company, not as the figure he'd spent years trying to impress or disagreed with in silence, or distanced himself from more than he'd recognized, as his father, a man who had also made mistakes, who had also chosen wrong sometimes, and who was asking for another chance. "We're okay," said Jackson, and he meant it. That same afternoon, Jackson drove to the taco truck on the corner. The woman running it looked up when he approached. She evaluated him for a second, the way someone does when they know their regulars well, and can tell immediately when someone doesn't quite fit the neighborhood. And then something in her face shifted. "Hey, aren't you the guy who came the other night with the serious young woman, the one who always comes here?" "That's me," said Jackson. "She's not with you today. I'm going to see her now." The woman nodded like that made complete sense. To go then, to go. She wrapped 2 tacos in paper and folded the ends over without rushing, the way someone does when they've done it 1,000 times. Jackson took them and drove to Lakeview Medical Center. He found Avery in the hallway on the 3rd floor, coming out of her mother's room, her hair loose from where it had been pinned back, her eyes carrying the specific kind of tired that isn't physical. When she saw him, she stopped. Jackson stopped too. Neither of them spoke for a moment. He extended his arm with the paper-wrapped package. "I don't know if you're hungry," he said, "but I figured, since you didn't eat anything that night." Avery looked at the package, looked at him. "You went all the way over there?" "She recognized me because of you." A small pause. "She asked where the serious young woman was. I told her I was going to see her." Avery made a sound that was half exhale, half laugh, the kind that comes without asking permission. Jackson took a step toward her. "Avery, I know the arrangement existed, and I know that's what started all of this, but what I felt over these weeks, that wasn't part of any plan." He spoke slowly, measuring each word without scripting it. "And if you felt something too that also wasn't part of any plan," he stopped. "I need to know, not because of 30 days, not because of the company, not to prove anything to anyone." He looked at her. "But because this is the first time in a long time that I want something that has nothing to do with winning or proving." Avery held his gaze for a long moment. "What I said on the terrace, I didn't hear the end," he said. A pause. "I know," Avery breathed. "I fell for you," she said, with the plainness that was exactly her. At some point it stopped mattering whether that was in the plan or not. Jackson exhaled, the way someone does when they've been holding their breath without knowing it for days. "I didn't come here to convince you of anything," he said. "I came to say something I didn't learn how to say until now." Pause. "Thank you." Avery looked at him. "For what?" "For making me someone who wants to deserve what he has," said Jackson. "That's the most valuable thing anyone has ever given me." The hospital hallway wasn't the most romantic setting in the world. It had fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic and the distant sound of a supply cart being rolled down a floor below. But Avery took the paper-wrapped tacos he was still holding and nodded. "Okay." And that was enough. What came after wasn't perfect. It never is. There were difficult conversations, the kind where you have to sit with something uncomfortable long enough to actually look at it. Jackson said sorry once in the middle of a Thursday afternoon for no particular reason except that he meant it. Not for the coffee, for all of it. Avery looked at him for a moment and then said, "Okay, just that." And somehow, that was the hardest and easiest thing either of them had said in weeks. Avery had to learn to receive. One evening he showed up at her apartment with groceries and no explanation other than, "You sounded tired on the phone." She stood in the doorway for a second, not sure what to do with that. Then she stepped aside and let him in. That was new for her. One evening, weeks after the scene at the house, the two of them were sitting in the backyard, and Avery told him something she had never told anyone. Not something dramatic, not a major secret, just the memory of what the first year of her mother's treatment had actually been like, how scared she'd been, how alone she'd felt even though she never said a word about it to anyone. Jackson listened, without interrupting, without offering solutions, just listened. And when she finished, he said, "Thank you for telling me that." And Avery understood, in that exact moment, that something was fundamentally different about this man than the one she'd met 3 weeks ago. But they built it, with honesty, with the humor that lives in things once you can laugh at them instead of carrying them forever, with the mistakes that bring people closer when you face them together instead of pretending they didn't happen, with long conversations in the backyard at night with bad break room coffee, with taco truck food in hospital hallways, with all the small things that turn out in the end to be the biggest ones. Diane got better, slowly but solidly and for real. The adjusted medication responded better than her doctors had projected, and there was a morning when Avery arrived at the hospital and found her mother sitting up in bed with her hair done, complaining that the breakfast was lukewarm and the TV had nothing worth watching at that hour. It was the best day in a long time. Avery sat beside her and didn't say anything for a while. She just stayed there, her mother's hand in hers, listening to the breakfast complaints and the commentary on the morning news like it was the most beautiful sound in the world. Jackson came that afternoon with a bag of fruit and the excuse that he was in the neighborhood. Lakeview Medical Center was not on the way to anywhere Jackson had any reason to be. Diane knew immediately. She found him funny. She told him he had the face of someone who had recently behaved very badly. Jackson didn't deny it. Diane studied him for a second. "My daughter doesn't say it," she said, "but she's someone who forgives when the remorse is real, and someone who doesn't when it isn't. So make sure you know which one you are." Jackson looked at her. "I know," he said. Diane nodded. "Good." Edward was at that hospital more often than anyone would have expected from a man in his position. And when Diane was discharged and walked out through the front doors of Lakeview Medical Center with her daughter at her side, it was Edward who arrived with flowers. Jackson watched him do it and held it in that place where you hold the things that actually matter. 8 months later, in a Harrington Group board meeting that started like any other and ended like none before it, Edward announced he was stepping down as CEO, and that leadership of the company would pass to 2 people, his son Jackson and his new strategic partner, Avery Collins. There was silence in the boardroom. There were exchanged looks. There was more than one person who didn't understand, and was going to take some time to understand. Edward looked at both of them. "This company needs intelligence, and it needs character," he said, "and I have seen, with my own eyes and in circumstances I won't be explaining here, that together they have both." Avery from her chair looked at Jackson. Jackson looked at her. In that look was something no deal, no plan, no 30-day challenge could have produced. Real trust. Built. Earned. The wedding was small. No grand venues. No guest lists full of people neither of them actually knew. It was in the backyard of the Harrington house, with the people who genuinely mattered. No more than 30. The ones who had been present in the moments that counted. Not the ones who showed up when it was convenient. Diane was in the front row, with more color in her cheeks than she'd had in years, and a smile that Avery hadn't realized how much she'd missed until she saw it fully back. Jackson watched Avery walk across the yard toward him and thought it was strange how someone can still surprise you even when you know them well. She moved the way she always had, with calm, with that way of occupying space without asking anyone's permission, and he thought that if anyone had told him 8 months ago that he'd end up here, in this backyard, waiting for that woman, he would have laughed, and he would have been completely wrong. Edward, standing to one side, watched Avery arrive, and for the first time in a long time, felt at peace with something. Jackson, who wasn't someone who said much in front of crowds, said just one thing. "The first time I saw you, I decided in 3 seconds who you were and what you were worth." He looked at her. "I was completely wrong about everything." A short pause. "Thank you for not walking away before I could learn otherwise." Avery smiled. "Thank you for eating everything at that diner without complaining." The laughter that followed was the kind that connects people, the kind that makes the air feel lighter, the kind people remember long after the moment has passed. Edward, seated beside Diane, was the first to applaud, and he kept applauding 1 beat longer than was necessary. Diane glanced at him. "You were the one who set all this in motion, weren't you?" she said quietly. Edward smiled. "I just took the first step," he said. "They did the rest themselves." Diane looked at him a moment. "They both paid a price for it." "I know," said Edward, "and they were both worth it, because sometimes parents also need to see that their mistakes aren't permanent, that the damage you cause can be repaired, that there is still time. There is always time if you choose to use it well. A spilled coffee, a public humiliation no one forgot, a challenge born from wounded pride that ended in something neither of them had planned. Avery wasn't looking for love when this all began. She was trying to do right by someone who had been good to her when no one else knew how, because that's what people like Avery do. They give back, not with money, not with words, with presence, with loyalty, with that quiet strength that doesn't make noise but that everyone notices the moment it's no longer there. Jackson wasn't looking to change. He believed, with the full certainty of someone who has never been genuinely challenged, that he didn't need to, that the world worked a certain way, that he occupied a fixed place in that world, that people who weren't on his level simply didn't count. And then a woman walked in carrying a tray of coffee, and everything he thought he knew started to come apart, not because she was extraordinary in any way he could have calculated, but because she was completely real in a world where he'd spent years surrounded by carefully constructed versions of people and of himself. Life has that habit of putting you exactly where you're most uncomfortable, so you can finally see what you'd been refusing to see, so you can meet the person you're capable of being when you stop hiding behind what you have and start risking who you are. And Edward sat beside Diane and watched his son laugh. Not the laugh Jackson used in meetings, not the one that meant he'd won something. The other one, the real one. The one Edward hadn't heard in years and had started to wonder if he'd imagined. He thought about everything it had taken to get here and decided it was worth it. All of it. Sometimes the most uncomfortable place in the world turns out to be the only place you would have found what you actually needed. This was the story of Avery and Jackson, and if you made it to the end, you already know the ending was exactly what they both deserved, both of them. Now I want to hear from you. What score do you give this one from 0 to 10? Leave it in the comments. Was it a 10? Did you want more? Did something feel missing? Tell me everything, because every story I bring here, I make it thinking of you.